there's been a very strong case made by economists and others that this is probably the best thing we could do for alleviating global poverty.
The things that effective altruists care about pushing for, that they care about being a part of and getting done, it's the these are things.
Not something Republican politicians are going to be open to.
Exactly. Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Cool. Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How about yourself?
I'm pretty good. Thank you for coming on today. Excited to talk.
Sure.
Just so you know, we are already live, so anything you don't want recorded, be careful. So we'll start. I want to start with the most softball question in the world, because there's been some controversy over this, but I think you can clear this up. Is it Richard Yetter Chappell or Chappell?
Chappell.
Chappell.
Rhymes with that.
Nice. That was the less expected but more fun answer. I like that. Okay, Richard Yetter Chappell. Cool. I think we heard Michael Humer once called you Richard Yetter Chappell, and nobody knew what the correct thing was. So how are you doing today?
I'm very good, thank you.
It's good.
Thanks for inviting me on.
Of course. So now for the real questions. I guess the first thing that I wanted to ask you is, you're obviously like a philosopher, specifically, if I'm not mistaken, like a fairly traditional utilitarian, right?
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, I sort of describe myself as utilitarian-ish, because I don't, strictly speaking, agree with all exact utilitarian claims, but it's something very close. So I defend a form of consequentialism that's very close to utilitarianism. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So what I was gonna ask is just going through your your daily life. There's this conversation in a lot of EA spaces about like naive versus sophisticated consequentialism. And I assume that you don't like go through every step of your life trying to like do a maximum expected utility calculus, what to eat for breakfast and whatnot. So I guess I was just gonna ask, like, how do you go about your life trying to make those ethical decisions?
Sure. I mean, I guess one thing to flag straight up is that I don't take myself to be a perfect consequentialist or utilitarian agent. I'm sure I do a lot of actions that I think aren't really, strictly speaking, justified. I'm a big fan of like vegetarians and vegans. I'm not myself even a vegetarian. Sometimes I eat meat. I think that's probably not justified. It would be better not to, but nobody's perfect. So I'm not going to pretend to be always maximizing the good or even really doing a very good job of even attempting to. But insofar as I do manage to be like, put some effort into being more good rather than less so, it's largely just a matter of sort of thinking about from the big picture, insofar as I'm willing to put moral effort into trying to make the world a better place and less of a bad one, where are the places where I can sort of most easily and most effectively make a difference there, and without it being too much of a personal burden. So one thing I've done is I signed up for the Giving What We Can pledge while I was still in grad school. I donate 10% of my income and have for many years now. And so that's something I do, donating to the most effective charities I can find, where I think that makes a big difference. And that's probably a much bigger difference than most other actions I might take on a day-to-day basis. If you compare to things like really putting a lot of effort into recycling or like cutting down on your like consumer sort of carbon footprint or any of those sorts of things, those just don't strike me as likely to be as significant as really directly donating resources to causes that can do a lot of good with them. So focusing more on the most effective ways of making a difference, as sort of what jumped out at me as being more important.
Sure, that makes a ton of sense. And if the segue wasn't clear, I guess the next question would be, how does that then translate into your interactions with politics as an individual?
Sure.
Both like
so
how you figure
as
out. Sorry.
Yeah. So I guess there's a couple of connections there. So there's one is just sort of thinking about how should we even think about politics, or what are sort of the important ways of thinking about politics generally. And then there's the sort of what can you do on an individual level in terms of political engagement. One limitation for me as a non-American and immigrant living in America is that I can't even vote here. So that's like one important political action that I can't even do. But I still like thinking about politics and contributing to discussions, at least sometimes. I mean, I don't always enjoy the discussions. Sometimes they get far too heated, but it's at least interesting to think about, valuable policies and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So focusing more on the sort of more intellectual question of like, what do I think is the right way to think about politics? There, in terms of being generally guided by a broadly utilitarian style welfarist consequentialism, I think there are really three things that jump out at me as being really important. So one is having a kind of outcome-oriented approach to thinking about politics, in contrast to a more sort of expressive or performative kind of approach. I mean, just an example of this, I think I've seen a lot of people sharing on Twitter recently the story of some Germans who were very excited about having shut down the last nuclear power plant there. And these were like environmentalists who were like, oh yes, no more nuclear power. And it's being replaced almost entirely by coal, which is so much worse. And so like you've got this really expressive, we're anti-nuclear, but not actually thinking about the effects in terms of actually this is really bad, it's leading to more coal. So just this contrast between the sort of superficial, what we can be expressing support for or against, and what the actual impact is of what these sort of political actions or policies are going to do, I think it's really important to be focused on the actual effects and how that's going to affect the things that matter. And the second big thing is, I think, having an expanded circle of moral concern. So much of politics is focused on local in a sense, I mean, generally national, but it's still in a sense fairly limited and local. And so I think even people on the left, who I think generally have much better values than many on the right, still I think are often very narrow in their values because they're very almost exclusively often concerned with poverty of the people within their own country. I think we should be much more concerned about global problems. And so thinking about global poverty, thinking about the treatment of non-human animals, and thinking about, protecting future generations, all of these strike me as, in a sense, really just much more important than merely the problem of sort of local relative poverty. And then the third thing I'd want to emphasize is just the importance of sort of cause prioritization. So even within the political realm, not just like when choosing charities, as effective altruists often talk about, it's really important to be cause neutral and to prioritize between where you can do the most good. But I think that's also true in politics generally. I think so much political discussion gets focused on really hot topics, culture war issues, for example. And, they're often important and, do significantly affect people in various ways. And so, you want to get it right rather than wrong. But I also think those really heated debates often aren't the ones that are actually going to score highest in terms of things like scale, the number of people affected, the tractability, the neglectedness. Certainly they're not at all neglected. So if we're sort of trying to think in a more sort of utilitarian style course prioritization way, it could also, I think, often lead us to think we really should be focusing on a very different set of issues than what tends to be the predominant focus in a lot of political debate.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I think I agree with the broad strokes of it. You talked about expanding our moral circle, right? And there's this like the left does slightly better, especially the further left you go in terms of like being more more amenable on animal rights and on the international stage instead of doing like a let's get socialism here, let's take care of our own, this like international socialism, this idea that it's like a global movement, versus or even just for progressives that just like you see more people involved in like the anti-war movement just for the purpose of like trying to protect those in other countries. But then there's this other question, I think, that obviously effective altruists talk about a lot, where we want to expand our moral circle not just to like other people in the world and not just to all of the animals that are in the world, but also to all of the future people that will be in the world or might be in the world. Right. And I think that I was going to ask, what are your thoughts about what are the politics that we can do to most value future people? I'm assuming it's going to be existential risk related things.
Yeah, so I think thinking about just potential global catastrophic risks, certainly ones that would be potential existential risks, but even ones that are not quite at that level, but just have like a next global scale. I mean, I think things like massive economic downturns and depressions are things that could have long-term detrimental consequences. So Tyler Cohen, I think, has talked about the importance of GDP growth as something that, for those of us on the left, we often think, oh, right wingers are too focused on like GDP. It's not the only thing that matters. And certainly it's not the only thing that matters. But it is one thing that really matters, because the amount of total wealth we have in society in future makes a big difference to how much we can actually provide to meet people's needs. And so if we can ensure that GDP in the future is going to be higher rather than lower, and, growing at a compounding rate, then that could make a big difference to how much good we can do for meeting people's future needs. But even aside from that, as you say, that there's the more dramatic cases of actual global catastrophic risks, trying to ward off, pandemics, AI risk, other technological risks. That's still stuff that seems very important. I'm not a policy expert, so I don't have great ideas for what to do in terms of AI governance and so forth. I just have the sense that, people should be thinking about that. That seems important.
Makes sense. We've talked about a few things here. The GDP growth in particular, I think that one's really interesting, because there's this trade-off that you have to some extent, not on every policy, but with this like substantial number of policies where you're trading off, on the one hand, this like trying to make GDP and the amount of wealth that we have to serve our people as much as possible, while also trading off the amount of corporate influence that does exist in our government, the amount of like lobbying and media power and meld between those two. So I guess I want to loop back to something you talked about earlier with the like, how do we do cause prioritization within politics? Do you have a way of doing that, or do you generally defer to other people, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a really good systematic answer there. I mean, there's a fair bit of deference to others. I think in general, economists are probably the people who are, most specialized and knowledgeable when it comes to thinking about trade-offs in public policy and so forth. And so I think, I try to read people who strike me as sort of economically informed and have interesting things to say here. And so I think that's, taking on board those kind of insights from the discipline of economics seems very important. But then also just in a more sort of humanistic way, also not losing sight of the people that are being affected. And so, I think another example of a policy that is not taken remotely seriously by like almost anyone in ordinary political debate, but does seem to score very highly on these kinds of criteria, would be something like open borders, right? Where it just seems like there's been a very strong case made by economists and others that this is probably the best thing we could do for alleviating global poverty, would be allow more people to come into the societies where there are really good opportunities and a really good return for their labor available. Almost nobody wants to do this. It would be political suicide, I take it, for any Democratic politician to explicitly come out in favor of open borders. Bernie Sanders has outright demonized it as a like right-wing libertarian plot for some reason. I don't quite know why he thinks that. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that a politician actually come out and do this, because I want good politicians to win their elections and not get completely crushed by backlash. But it does seem to be like a kind of policy idea where there seems to be a lot going for it in principle. At least, we might not want to rush into it if we're not, there's a lot of uncertainty about the consequences. So you want to go sort of boost immigration gradually. But it should be seen as an ideal that we work towards. And it does seem like a case where having sort of intellectuals, thought leaders, activists try to make the case to get more of the public on board with the idea and have it be less demonized does seem something that in the long term would be a kind of valuable thing for trying to improve sort of public opinion and the sort of space of politically feasible policy options. Would be a vastly increased immigration was seen as more feasible.
Yeah, I think I have a sort of similar concept when it comes to democracy in the workplace. I have this like I have a belief. It's with a very high credence that high levels of democratization at work would be like very, very beneficial. It would allow us to mitigate a lot of things, and like like a corporate propagandistic media, like the current structure of AI safety right now. We have to worry about not just alignment, not just figuring out what's good, but also making sure the people that are in power are the people who are willing to do good.
Mm.
And I think that's a lot easier when you can have a democratization of the development of AI. Um, Especially for like if you're a consequentialist and you want to value people's like experiences or preferences impartially. It doesn't make a ton of sense to like massively ward off that power to a small group of the population. Um,
Mm.
and obviously the classic ones of climate change and pandemic risk of like making sure that we don't have all of these animal agriculture advertisements and subsidies and this big push for a supposedly healthy unhealthy diet. Um, all of these different ways that I think that it would be like it would make it much easier to handle these problems. And even just for something like open borders or open borders in particular, I think there's combination of those who are like very corporate interested, like who lean one way or the other on the issue.
Mm.
But for other policies that we know are good, just things that like I know you talked about UBI in the past, right? That's not very popular amongst those
Sure.
who are in the corporate capitalist class, but like you were saying, the economists show that like every instance of like a case study or a small scale study or even some of the slightly bigger studies, they're all going to show really good positive effects of that, and getting that is a lot easier if we don't have this huge conglomerate of corporate pushback. But
Yes, I
on
mean,
the
if you just give people cash, it can do a huge amount of good for them. It gives them options, and they can choose from there, what their highest priorities are, what it is that they need. Just seems like, yeah, it should be a much higher priority. I think politically would be getting money in people's pockets who need it.
Exactly, yeah. But on the other hand, there's this question of like, how much is this democracy at work idea politically viable, right? Because there's on the
Mm.
one hand, it seems like very viable. We have like Reagan who proposed like worker cooperatives. He like pushed forward legislation to like try and encourage worker cooperatives. And we have like very successful experiments in worker democracy in places like the Nordic countries where we have like a strong social wealth fund presence, very strong like worker cooperative and consumer cooperative presence, especially in the form of credit unions. And these
Mm.
seem to perform at least as well, in many cases better than the like in their respective fields where they do well than the current type of firm that we have. Um,
Do you have a theory on why they haven't emerged more just in our current setting? I mean, I take it there's nothing stopping worker cooperatives from forming even in America today. So if they would be more efficient, more effective, why isn't that just happening already?
So I think it depends on the field, right? I don't think that worker cooperatives are more effective in every field. I think that some combination of worker cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, social wealth funds, and state-owned enterprises are going to be more efficient in their respective fields. So I think that where consumer cooperatives have done well, they have faced some amount of funding discrimination, some amount of just educational discrimination. People don't know of it as much. Um,
Mm.
and some amount of a sort of systemic discrimination, where the type of person who wants to start a capitalist firm is going to be somebody who already has the money to start a firm, whereas workers who want to control their own enterprise, if they're trying to start a firm, they're losing out by trying to do it to like to build it for everyone else, right? There's like not an economic incentive to do it. So I think for the call it maybe a sixth, maybe even a little bit less of the economy where worker cooperatives are really good. Um, I think that like there's been there hasn't been the chance for them to grow and take over those fields, except in countries like Norway, where they make up almost the entirety of the forestry industry, or these types of
Oh, interesting.
like very it tends to be lower capital intensity type industries. Um,
Mm.
so the the question then becomes just like we have all of these places where they succeed, and then we also have this fact that there's like it's mixed up with a bunch of like dirty politics of the past, right? The history of democracy at work is going to be marred by like Cold War propaganda. It's going to be marred by like the existence of authoritarian countries who pretended to practice this democratization of the workplace, like the Soviet Union, while very very quickly having it subsume into a small elite party. Or those that did practice democracy at work without practicing democracy at the state, like in like Tito's Yugoslavia. Um, and it leads to this like complicated history that makes it, I think, harder to sell to the average person. So, how much should we prioritize advocating for this this very very broad solution that allows us to do a lot more good in the future, that allows us long term to maybe have a much stronger, healthier system, versus how much do we prioritize things that we know we can pass into policy now, and how much are those contradictory?
Yeah, no, it's a really tricky question. I mean, I don't think there's any sort of simple answer that I can give there, and I think probably just different people could very reasonably come up with sort of different verdicts in terms of both how high a priority or how likely it is that they think that this intervention, if it succeeded, would make a huge difference long term, like how important they see the very sort of idea of worker cooperatives and so forth, workplace democracy. Um, but insofar as you sort of reasonably believe that that would be a really beneficial long-term solution to a lot of problems, then I think it would make sense to give a pretty high priority to trying to make that a reality. I mean, if you can see a feasible way forward to persuading people to do it, which
Right.
is always a challenge to convince people of new things, but I think that's true of anything in any policy. So I certainly wouldn't rule it out. Um, but yeah,
So,
I can't really say how to do the exact math, what numbers to put on these things. I mean, in a way, I don't really think the solution is ever to literally do a math equation. It's just a matter of sort of judgment of how likely is this to do how much good, and does it seem plausible that this is the best thing in expectation compared to a somewhat safer bet, like trying to get people to support more redistribution in the here and now for people who need it or something along those lines.
that makes sense. I think that I read it somewhere on an EA forum. I don't remember exactly the post, but there's a phrase that I've heard a couple of times in EA that's it's in the cases where it is good to do math. Sometimes it's better to pull a few numbers out of your ass and do math with those numbers than it is to just pull a number out of your ass. But it's not like you're actually it's not like you can mathematically determine every single part of the equation. It's more just like how do we get a sense
It's
of
like a
what's going on
sanity
here?
check
Yeah, exactly.
to sort of get within a few orders of magnitude of the right kind of sense of how this compares to other potentially high impact kinds of possibilities.
Exactly, yeah. So I guess the the place where I wanted to go with that was just uh, we can talk a little bit more about policies. I kind of want to loop back around to X risk in a bit, but before we do that, I wanna ask about specifically political action. I know that you said that you had the easy one taken away from you, which is just like how much good can you do by casting a vote, right?
Yeah.
And in some of like the primary elections, sometimes that can be like a more complicated question. But when it comes down to how do Democrats handle things like climate change? How do they handle things like pandemics, like COVID-19? How do they handle things like artificial intelligence risk when we have Democrats passing the Chips Act, and we have the Trump administration blocking the Chips Act because it was too much of a financial burden and Trump didn't like the budget. When we have these like really really black and white, like these people are doing what they can to like reduce the risk of some sort of very very bad event like climate change or our misaligned artificial intelligence, and the other side is not doing anything. Even if one side's like not doing perfect at it, if they have a lot of biases, if they're like not as educated on the topic as they could be, like AI discourse has obviously been a nightmare. Um,
Sure.
but in spite of this, I think that it's like really really clear that like if you just spend 5 minutes voting for on these national important policies, and maybe there's more nuance on the local level, but these national important levels of like how do we make sure that the right groups are in the Senate and the House and whatnot. Um, I imagine you would agree that like voting is a very, very effective way of doing that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's going to depend, on a state-by-state basis, who the actual candidates are and how much of a close race it's going to be. Um, for presidential elections, it makes a massive difference whether you're in a swing state or, a completely safe state. There might be no point at all in voting for the president if you're in DC or
Mhm.
um, Texas. um, but there are certainly a lot of places where I think it's hugely effective and definitely worth doing. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people say there's a vanishingly small chance that your vote is going to make a difference, and that's true. It's vanishingly small, but the potential impact is so disproportionately huge if you were to make a difference that it's very worthwhile. Just an expectation.
I do
Um,
think, sorry,
yeah, no, continue.
I do think it's interesting you mentioned Texas though, because I know the story for a long time has been that it's going blue, it's going purple, but if it's been like a warning that hasn't come true in the same way that like a lot of fairly red states in the past, like I was born in Colorado, used to be a very, very red state. And we find that the legislature doesn't actually go blue until well after the population goes blue. Mostly because it's very, very easy on the state level to like gerrymander elections, right? It's
Right.
very, very easy to get like corporate influence on that on that very, very small scale, and very easy to do like voter suppression on the state level.
Mm.
Um, but I think that given how close some of these races have been, very, very like 2 point races, I don't think it's fair to count out Texas as like it's not quite yet a swing state, though it would be if it was like a more democratic state, right?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be the deciding state in any presidential election very soon. But yeah, there's definitely trending in a more purple direction than a decade ago I would have guessed. So there are promising signs for sure.
And it would be more likely to do that if not necessarily voting on the presidential level, but voting on that governor level, voting on that state level. You're more likely to have like a democratic state where the people's voices can be shown.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, partly it might even be, even if this particular election you don't have a chance of changing who wins, it might be that just getting the margins closer will encourage more people next time around to get involved, so that you could still try to make a case based on those indirect effects that it was worth getting the margins closer.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess the next question is just when you this is the easy case, right? This is the case where we say that like the we spend 5 minutes and we can have a far outsized effect on the world, and that's the point of our system, right? That's why we have a democracy, is that so that you can spend those 5 minutes to have that effect on your country and your government, and other countries through the way that government interacts with those countries. But beyond that, I think we started to get questions of how much do we prioritize politics over some of the other causes, some of the other things that we care about. Um, and I know that for a consequentialist, the answer should be easy, and I think you've talked about that before. It's just what's going to have the best consequences. But
Right.
um, eh, I think that becomes uh, somewhat muddied when like most of the other things that long termists are starting to dive into as we get more later and later into the movement. There's more uncertainty and more possible good consequences. So I guess the question is, how do we weigh spending our time, spending our money, dedicating our careers towards these towards, for example, making sure that like Democrats get into power, making sure that we push politics, push the politicians towards the what we have good information to say will work very well. Um, and how do we push or versus how much do we just prioritize like I'm going to go into AI safety, I'm going to donate to AI safety, I'm not going to worry about like what the political structure of the world in which I'm in. We're already in that world. I'm just going to go participate in that.
Yeah, I mean, I have very sort of low confidence in a lot of empirical questions that lead me to be very reluctant to give like confident pronouncements of what people should do in these sorts of trade-offs. I think it's just very unclear. So
Mm-hmm.
I get very, very cautious of like necessarily condemning or criticizing anyone for going either of those directions when faced with a tricky case like that. It just seems like, it's a difficult judgment call. I think you could reasonably think politics was the most effective thing you could do, and really go all in on sort of activism, political donations, really trying to improve things via that means. I also think someone could reasonably think, maybe politics isn't the most important thing. Maybe we can more directly achieve good work just directly through our careers and through influencing the way that people are thinking about these issues, and go through more sort of civil society and even sort of corporate career kind of options for trying to do good. I think that seems like a reasonable sort of possible set of judgments someone could have. Um, Stepping back and kind of looking at it in a more big picture way, I think given the amount of uncertainty that I at least have about the whole sort of range of possibilities here, I kind of feel most comfortable with a sort of portfolio approach in which we weren't putting all our eggs in one basket, but rather, there are some people pursuing the political means to do good, some people pursuing apolitical means to do good, and I'm really happy to see both of those. So to some extent, my inclination is just to be pretty differential to other people's judgments and be like, well, what seems most important to you? Where do you think you can do a lot of good? And that might also depend on issues of personal fit as well, not just your judgment about the world, but your judgment about how you can fit into the world in a way that will be sort of not leading to burnout, in ways that you'll be passionate and excited about and will continue to do good work, over the long term of your sort of career, or what, um, general efforts. So that was a bit of a wishy-washy answer. It was kind of a refusal to answer in a way, but hopefully at least somewhat illuminating about my reasons for being vague.
No, that totally makes sense. And there's just this obvious case of like there's a marginal utility of any type of action that like an effective altruist would try to focus on, right? If it were the case that like everybody went into like AI safety, the amount of AI safety, the amount of AI companies that actually exist, the amount of like funding that we could gather, the amount of and the amount of extra good that each individual person can do is going to end up going way down, as opposed to if instead of every single effective altruist doing that, we had some small portion at least go to like animal welfare, and some other small portion go to like climate change, in case that happens before we get to AI, because we're so uncertain about the AI timelines.
Sure. Yeah, I think
So
that's exactly right. Given diminishing returns, just having a really sort of spread out approach with different people trying different things seems pretty wise.
So I don't mean to push on a question that you were more reluctant to answer, but I guess the question would be not necessarily what's the best thing to do, but how should individuals figure out what's the thing that they should do, right? How should they go about like figuring out like where can I have the most effect? Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things that it'll make sense to focus on there, as one, sort of what's their distinctive sort of individual aptitudes, like what sort of feedback have they gotten from people in different areas of life to suggest that they could be sort of disproportionately good and effective in one sphere of life compared to another. So I think that's maybe something that the 80,000 hours people really emphasize in their sort of career advice is personal fit for this reason. Whereas that you actually have distinctive skills where you could do a lot of good. And then the second thing that obviously is maybe the more obvious necessary thing to do is just to try to form some kind of comparative judgment about the options in the world itself, in terms of what are the highest priority sort of possible levers where someone with suitable skills could make a real difference. And so, it's reasonably clear how there are some political levers that can be pulled and make a real difference. And so if you were in a position to be able to pull those levers, that could be really great. In a similar way, it seems, at least maybe in a sense less clear, but at least very plausible that we need to be exploring this in terms of AI safety, the people who might be in a position to try to make things safer there. It's not clear yet what could be done to make it go better, but it's at least fairly clear that it's important to explore. And so, for the people who have the distinctive skills to be able to do that well, that also seems like, you can make a strong case for that being the priority. So I guess I'm not saying what the answer is so much as, as you're asking, how would one even go about deciding it? And I guess my answer is try to form a judgment about what are the stakes of the situation, how tractable is it, what specific interventions would be needed to actually make a difference and to improve things, and then ask, are you well suited to make that difference? Which of these different options are you going to have the best chance at making the biggest difference at?
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. So with that idea, when we start to think about like political action, I think that once we're starting to consider like what is the most effective action, what is what can we do, or what should we do? Should we do anything beyond this simple like we have a very simple lever of voting and making sure that we do a little bit of good there? What's I guess the way that I want to ask this question is, what's somewhere where you find yourself frustrated with the the people that you would otherwise consider political allies and the types of political action that they take?
Sure.
What do you think that they could do better? And to close it all off, I guess, what are some strengths that you think that they already have that you think you could lean into, that they could lean into?
Yeah, good question. So I guess maybe one, I think, possibly obvious thing that's just often pretty neglected is the importance of money. So I think, donating to, good people in close races seems like a really worthwhile thing to do. Often people will be more inclined to donate to, whoever's running against Mitch McConnell. It's like try to support them, even when there's like no chance that that's going to work. So trying to think about how your money could be used to actually achieve good political results rather than just sort of signal opposition to bad people, that seems important. I guess in terms of the things that actually like annoy me on a personal level, like the things that, that I don't think this really reflects objective importance in any way, but just, what I guess I'm exposed to politically on a day-to-day basis is mostly like discourse of certain kinds, particularly, the way people argue on Twitter and Facebook and stuff. And so maybe the thing that's like most annoying to me about that is when people are maybe starting to think in a kind of tribalistic kind of way and not really thinking about the relevant counterfactuals. So I think just a nice example of this that I think is quite vivid is think about all the hate that was directed at Joe Manchin a couple of years ago. Don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but
I think
in
so.
terms of okay, cool. So I mean, just in terms of like him being the most conservative Democrat in the Senate is obviously like a target for like, he's blocking doing really valuable things. And it's understandable that people would like find that salient and annoying. But if you think about in terms of the relevant counterfactuals, like if Manchin retired, who was he going to be replaced with? I mean, in a sense, he is the most progressive member of the Senate in counterfactual terms. Just the gap between him and the voting populace in his state and who he would be replaced with next time. So I think making this a bit more salient and thinking, well, you can't just think he's a Democrat, therefore he should be doing all the things that we would expect of like, other Democrats. They're in very different political situations. And so actually, I think people should be much more grateful to Manchin and think, oh, given that he's a senator from West Virginia, he was actually supporting a lot of really good things. Didn't go as far as we might have liked in many cases, but did a lot of good compared to the alternative. Whereas, in other cases, I think it's just sort of a mistake to think that, like, because he's a Democrat, you have to hold him to much higher standards compared to, like, imagine if he were a Republican and he was supporting the Democrats on as many things as he did. Be like, well, this is the best Republican ever. So I think partly just sort of thinking about the relevant counterfactuals there, and sort of not getting too hung up on things like party labels and feeling like someone is a traitor or something like these kinds of things. There's something that just sort of strikes me about the discourse as somewhat annoying.
For sure, yeah. I can definitely relate to that because like but when we think about like what do we get out of criticizing Joe Manchin? Like we get like somewhat of a rallying cry, but at the expense of like first of all the opportunity cost of other actions, and I'll get to that in a second. But also
Yeah.
at the expense of like at potentially not having the support for what might be an important campaign to stop Republicans from being able to like roll back climate legislation, from being able to like not just like stalwart it like Joe Manchin wants to, just stay where we are, but to be able to do active harm. Um, and going back to the opportunity cost, one, even if you're going on this individual level, if there's like a candidate that you want to primary, it's Kirsten Sinema. She might not be
Absolutely.
not quite as far right as Joe Manchin, but like her constituency isn't anywhere near as far right as her. She's like she has like
Exactly.
a truly progressive constituency that you could appeal to. But for some reason, that there just hasn't been that. There hasn't been that like focus on like what could be effective action there. And
Right.
even beyond that, do you know who Michael Brooks is?
Doesn't ring a bell.
Okay, so I guess Michael Brooks was a a political commentator. He was, I think, most known for his work on the Majority Report. But he had a phrase that I think that's permeated um, well into, I think, some of the more effective progressive spaces of be kind to individuals, but be ruthless to systems.
Mm.
Um, and this focus on individuals like Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, as opposed to a focus on like why do we have a system where we give the relatively small population of West Virginia such
Right.
disproportionate voting power in the Senate? Why do we let them send like why do we let them send the same number of people as like California, or
Yeah.
Texas
Exactly.
even? Um, so it seems unfortunate that, especially since 2016, it seems like or not 2016, since like 2019, it seems like the left has taken this like disappointing turn towards falling back into criticizing only individuals.
Mm.
When Republicans are in power, it's like a system that's all at fault for like putting them in power. But once Democrats get into power, it's the fault of Joe Biden. It's the fault of Joe Manchin. It's
Right.
not the fault of like a system that's like stopping the process from occurring in the way that that presumably like a consequentialist or somebody who believes in democracy would like it. Um,
Yeah. So yeah, democratic reform, I think, is another sort of cause area where it seems, potentially really high stakes. Like a lot of good could happen there. Very difficult in terms of tractability, but
right.
you know,
And
worth
there's the
pursuing.
question of like um, eh, that type of reform towards like democracy is a very, very long run type of reform. It
Right.
means we don't get what we want now. It means that maybe we're more likely to get what we want in the future. And I think that there's like uh, I think it's probably still worth doing in the short term, but I feel like there has to be some point at the future as we're like approaching generalized artificial intelligence, as we're approaching this like this precipice of climate change of like it's either reversible or it's not. As we're like getting to a point with animal agriculture and pandemics where like it, there's some probability at any given point that like this pandemic will be the one, right? Like the next one that comes out every like 5 to 10 to 15 years, probably more and more rapidly based on the evidence we've seen. Um, it may be some small chance, but like at a certain point we're approaching like we don't have time to focus on these long run strategies. Um, so I guess a question would be, how do you see your priorities changing in the future? And how do we like stay up to date and not get caught up in like this is the strategy I've been pursuing, so the strategy has to be the most effective?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess in general, I've often been inclined to sort of have more of a long run view and think that, passing a good policy today isn't as important as improving the system so that we're able to do more good things in future. But as you point out, I guess there could reach a time, particularly if AI risks sort of started to eventuate. We got near the end of the timeline there. I don't have a lot of confidence that will happen, but it's at least a possibility. If it did, then we would obviously need to change gears pretty quickly and be like, hang on, there's an actual urgent emergency on our doorstep right now. We can't just sort of cruise along and keep trying to build up capacity to deal better with future problems if there's now a serious risk that, if we don't change course in the next decade, then there won't be a future. So, if you really did end up on the doorstep or sort of on the precipice of an existential risk like that, then yeah, we sort of need to be prepared to both identify when that's the case and then completely switch gears and sort of get all hands on deck for dealing with it if that does eventuate. I have a huge range of uncertainty. I just have no clue how likely it is that that's actually going to happen. I know, some people are super confident, others think like there's zero chance. My credences are kind of completely spread out across almost that entire range. I think almost anything could happen there. And I just don't have a lot of confidence either way. So I wouldn't want to I wouldn't want to put all my eggs in one basket in terms of saying we have to entirely get prepared to deal with this one threat and then maybe it never eventuates and we just wasted a lot of resources and effort. But on the other hand, I also think it would be a huge mistake to just completely poo-poo it and be like, let's just ignore it, no matter what. Mm-hmm. You need to have some sort of warning flags ready. So yeah, again, I guess my instincts are always to go for kind of the mushy middle ground, and maybe that's coming through here a bit too.
Yeah, I think that makes sense though. The diversity of investment is probably pretty crucial. When we're talking about artificial intelligence, I think that it's more than reasonable to have very, very high degrees of uncertainty. But I think that there's also this question of to make an analogy, for some of the trans research that we have on gender affirming care, we have very, very wide confidence intervals on how much that will work, right? A study off the top of my head that I'm thinking of is there's a 95% chance that it's somewhere in between 20% and 65% reduction in suicide for a given gender affirming treatment, right? Which is a huge interval. It's a 45% interval. But at the same time, if we have a 95% chance that it's at least 20%, that seems a huge thing on its own to be considering. Sure. So to move that over to the idea of AI, right? I think that we probably should have a very, very wide confidence interval. I don't think we should have a 95% confidence interval until towards the end of the century, maybe even later. But the question still comes of I guess maybe it sounds like you might have a higher credence that we'll just never get to generalized intelligence. I'm curious to delve into why you think that is. But as far as dealing with the very, very high probability that that it might happen soon, right? That there's something that might occur. I know the one that I always reference now is Ajaya Katra came out with a 2-year update on the bioanchors model. I'm sure you're familiar, where she adds to the bioanchors model some updates based on arguments about how intuition could be replaced essentially by large memory bases, how the eh, the GPTN can serve as an anchor, and generally a few arguments of like how do we make this model stronger that end up making the timeline a little shorter and putting the median at 2040. That's when she says there's a 50-50 chance. And maybe you're more skeptical about that. I tend to appreciate her, one, because she just seems like she has like more expertise on the subject than pretty much anyone I've ever seen. Um,
Sure.
but also because like looking into the model, like I can't imagine very many ways that it could be more accurate. Um, so I guess the question to ask you would just be like where are your approximate credences for the ideas of like we'll never get to generalized intelligence, that it'll happen this century, and that it'll happen um, like really really soon, like in the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah. I would be pretty surprised if it didn't happen this century. I think the kind of timelines you described there sound vaguely plausible to me, and plus, I'm not an expert, so I'm happy to like defer to the more knowledgeable people who do sort of say things along those lines. So that seems like, yeah, that sounds plausible. Um, I'm definitely not in a position to disagree with them about that. Um, so yeah, then I think that the uncertainty is maybe more around the question of how great a risk does it pose to have AGI. So
Sure.
that's where I think there are sort of strong grounds for thinking like there's certainly a risk there, like that we don't we can't be sure that it's going to be safe. So it sure is worth protecting against some of those potential risks. But I guess I'm also not like a 99% doomer either.
That makes sense. Yeah. I think there's definitely this case of the sooner it is, the more of a risk it is, right? Because if capabilities are scaling as fast as they are right now, and for whatever reason there isn't like a huge blockage there, but there is this like general flatlining that the alignment field has been, and there's been some progress, admittedly, like interpretability. We've seen some really interesting work come out of that. I think Anthropic, in particular, has done some really interesting work, especially in terms of like uh, trying to figure out like what's going on in terms of like what the AI knows, what it thinks it knows, how much like awareness does it have of those types of things, how much like logic is it actually engaging in. Um, but that's just like interpretability is like the first step of just like figuring out if there is a problem or not at all. So like how do we create something where there isn't a problem? Um, so the I guess the question then, um, to loop back around, if we have these like if we have 20 years, I think it makes a ton of sense to right now be saying we get the democratic reform when it becomes really really important, as the probabilities start to like uh, reach their like reach their peak of distribution. I don't want to say like reach their peak because like presumably there's going to be like the peak probability would be like by like 20 but by infinite years, right? By like infinite years in the future. But their peak of distribution around that median 50-50. How how uh, how certain do we have to be that it is soon? I guess before it makes sense to start like changing our strategy.
Mm. I don't know that there's any general answer that could be given to that. Just in the sense that there might not be a single moment that is like the change of strategy time. It might rather be a more gradual thing where as you sort of get closer, there's going to be more and more steps that it makes sense to start making, um, and uh, and those will eventually accumulate really close, then you'll want to sort of be putting a lot of more efforts into addressing the problem. But even before that stage, there might have been a number of increments in terms of like when it made sense for more and more people to shift their attention. So I think there's just going to be a lot of different margins there rather than one big one,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. Um, it, I guess somewhat of a pivot, but I don't want to keep you for too long. We've been going for an hour now, and I want to make sure that we get to all the topics. You were saying, uh, uh, we've talked a lot about like things like UBI, things like these like economic policies. It I I think that the I guess this is a two-pronged question. I'll save the second prong for the next question. So with these things, how much do you think politics can contribute to, I guess, and vice versa, um, eh, building like effective altruist movements, right? Like when we talk about something like UBI, we know that UBI is much more likely to make people more charitable, right? They're much more likely to give in general. Um,
Yeah.
we have these sort of attitude shifts, and there's just this basic idea that like when the um, the powerless are given just a little bit more power, um, they're much more likely to be empathetic with that power. They're much more likely to consider themselves aligned with those who are even more powerless than them. Um,
Right.
and there's this general idea that even those that were that were already doing good are much more likely to be doing good. So and then on the other hand, there's this like um, there seems to be this ability for effective altruists to like have substantial impacts on policy. If we look at organizations like 80,000 Hours, they're doing a lot in terms of like their top their top options for a lot of these priorities, and their like top three always is like go into research or policy for this topic so that you can influence the policy that goes around on this topic. Um,
Yeah.
so with that though, there also seems to be this reluctance from the a large swath of the EA movement to say like we want to make sure that our movement's apolitical, just so that it is as acceptable to the public as possible. Um,
Mm.
but there's this trade-off also of like you don't necessarily get to build the political allies that you would want to get the causes that you want to get across. You don't get to be part of any coalition. You don't get to influence any coalition. You don't get to have people work with you for the causes that you care about as much. So I guess the the question is how much can and should the like I said before, the work that's done in politics bolster the effective altruist movement, and how much can the effective altruist movement and how much should it bolster political movements?
Yeah, that is a really tricky one. I mean, I guess my inclination is to lean more towards the side of thinking that effective altruism per se should remain apolitical, just in order to be sort of welcoming to as broad a tent as possible. And I mean, just in terms of thinking about what the core principle and sort of idea of the movement is, put your resources and efforts towards trying to do as much good as you can. I think that's something which doesn't build into the very definition any sort of particular political party or movement or whatever. So I mean, I just think it's something where even someone who doesn't like Democrats for particular reasons could still want to do a lot of good via other means, and I think we should be welcoming of that and not trying to sort of alienate those people. But I guess I do think it would be important not to like completely ignore the importance of politics as well. And as you mentioned, things like having an influence on things like pandemic policy are hugely important. And this is the sort of things that 80,000 Hours and other effective altruists do emphasize as something that's really worth trying to do. I guess the tricky question is it's the way to, I guess there are two different means by which one might try to have a sort of policy influence here. One is through something like kind of apolitical expert advice. And I think
Mhm.
this is kind of the standard route of like, becoming a researcher and just become an expert in the field and then give apolitical expert advice to whoever is, whoever are the people in power. This is what a good pandemic policy would be. Consider implementing it. I guess another kind of thing to do is the more sort of grassroots political organization aspect of it. We try to elect people who have better views on the importance of pandemic prevention and defeat the people who have worse views. Um, and I guess that's something where I would think it's probably really good for a lot of people who happen to be effective altruists and think this would be a good way to improve the world to get involved in doing those things. But they maybe wouldn't necessarily do it under the label or umbrella of effective altruism. So I think you could have sort of effective altruist aligned grassroots organizations or political movements, but it wouldn't have to be, the same thing. It wouldn't have to be, under the label of effective altruism per se. So I guess it's having some kind of separation between the kind of overtly political actions and this more sort of abstract idea of doing good, where different people can reasonably disagree about the best means of doing that. That seems like something that makes sense to me. And then there's still room for, even within the more sort of politically neutral kind of big tent conception of it, to still try to have an influence on policy just by talking about the issues on their merits rather than trying to get involved in party politics, for example.
Okay, that makes sense. The so I do want to push back a little bit though on
Sure.
this notion that like of like apolitical pandemic policy, right? I think that that was something that was really, really intuitive and made a ton of sense before we saw what happened with COVID-19. Um, but now we're looking at it and just basic things like this is the research on pandemic policies, make sure that like people know about it. That alone is like a very, very controversial piece of research or information, right? Um, we're at a time where like all of the biggest long-termist projects that effective altruists seem to care about have like a very, very political tone to them, right? With AI, there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen in terms of regulation. Regulation isn't something that's super liked by one side of the aisle. There's a lot of things that need to happen in terms of like deciding the political economy of the situation, deciding who's in charge of AI development, who gets to have the influence. Um, with climate change, we have like I don't know if I need to say any more words than climate change. Like
Sure.
the history of like of corporate influence that way. And even thinking back to like what effective altruism is, if it's this idea of like how do we do the most good, presumably like a consequentialist leaning ethic is like underlying it. That alone is a very like it has its roots in a very one-sided political story of like Bentham and Mill in particular being Mill being like a liberal socialist cooperativist who was like wildly ahead of his time on things like on women's rights, on things like workers' rights, on things like race equality, on all of these really, really important issues.
Not so great on imperialism, but we'll put that one aside.
I I think that one's debatable because
Okay.
his work there is like he he was part of the East India British Trading Company, but as part of the East India British Trading Company, and this is according to all of his writings, his goal was to not to it's not because he supported what they were doing, but because he thought it was better that he was having an influence than somebody else, right?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But I agree that the there could have been some better long term thought that went into probably what he was doing there and how much good he could have been doing. Um, but either way, right? We have this, and then we have Sedgwick, also talking about this very very progressive politic. And if we're just considering like how can we gain the most from effective altruism, having like people leaning through on effective altruism, um, influencing political movements, but maintaining this like apolitical veneer, I think has inspired many on the left who would otherwise be very very amenable to the ideas of like expanding your moral circle to anybody who's like able to experience to these like very like how do we do the most good type frameworks, as opposed to like thinking about things like desert ethics. I think these things would be things that would be very very amenable, but I think that there's this like presentation that makes it very very hard for us to sell that like if you're a progressive, these are the top priorities that are like if we don't mitigate X risks, you're much better than the conservatives, but like how do we get you on board with the most effective action in the things that you already care about? And I think that would be much easier if we just embraced some of the political nature of it, and vice versa. I think that there's a legitimacy that it provides to the movement in terms of like effective altruism. Just those words are like about as great as an image of a movement that you could want, right? Like you want to be good at doing good. It's just like
why would you be opposed to that? Yeah.
exactly. And so being able to say like this is the politics of being good at doing good. I think that could that could make it seem like the things that we're pushing are much more likely to get passed. And I don't think that I think we might be able to get like maybe more conservative voters on board with effective altruism, and some of the important things as far as like making the changes that need to be made. But I think that as far as like swaying the fat powerful in politics, it would it would benefit us to recognize that like the things that effective altruists care about pushing for, that they care about being a part of and getting done, it's the these are things
not something Republican politicians are going to be open to.
Exactly, yeah. Even these things that seem apolitical, like pandemic risk.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there could be. I mean, it's yeah. Again, I don't really have enough sort of empirical background to have any confident verdict there. I guess part of my maybe where I'm coming from is just sort of thinking about things like think about like sort of non-partisan get out the vote sort of civic engagement kind of projects, which obviously are very sort of left-leaning in effect. A big part of why we want to get out the vote is especially, like amongst college students and so forth, young voters are often a big focus here, is partly because we think that will have better political effects. But still, as so far as it can reasonably be presented as in a sense, a non-partisan goal, a goal that you can be recognized as a good thing without having to have any overtly sort of political commitments. I think there are some advantages to that, just in terms of sort of not coming off as too, just like a partisan hack or something. So I think there are at least some advantages to being more sort of politically neutral when it's possible, but I guess, as you say, there are also costs in terms of things like coalition building. So how those weigh out at the end of the day, I just don't really know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that it was very, very smart for effective altruism to start the way that it did, right? I think even well before all of the long-termism, it made sense to have like Peter Singer just saying like, buy malaria nets, right? This is how we do good. We're going to buy as many malaria nets as possible. And I think that was like a great way of building, like, we have an introduction to the culture now, right? We have this like this very very simple argument for like, here's one way in which just spending a little bit of money can do a lot of good, a huge amount of good. And from there, I think that it made sense also to say like, okay, well, now that we have a group built around doing good, This is a very simple argument, but I don't know that that means that it's actually the best one, right? It's very easy to sell, but it's like there may be more complex causes which we have less empirics for, but that end up being more important. And I think in all of that, having it be very, very open ended on the end of the sort of like the Peter Singer type a Peter Singer type effective altruism. It makes a ton of sense to leave that like completely apolitical as like an entry point. But when we start talking about like on the long termist sides of things, like the how do we mitigate these existential risks to the biggest degree possible, as the biggest ways to have an effect end up being this, or maybe not necessarily, that there's obviously disagreement there, but as huge portions of how we have to have an effect end up being like, how do we handle the political economy of this situation? How do we handle the political pushback that's going to come from this science once it's released? I think that there's an appropriate transition to be made. So like you said, there's benefits to both, but I think that those benefits manifest at different times, and I think heading into this more crucial period, I guess the ability to do good is probably going to rest upon our ability to have other people there who are willing to do good and to boost the other people who are doing good who aren't necessarily directly involved in the like effective altruist movement.
Yeah, that's plausible. Yeah, it does seem like it's to some extent becoming maybe inevitably political to be able to actually implement the kinds of things that are needed for long-termism. Yeah.
It's 11:20. I want to let you go here really soon. We'll probably cut this off at like 11:30 if that's okay.
That's great. Yeah.
So the last couple questions I guess I want to ask you are what what pushed you towards the being I guess I guess at the beginning you don't really choose to be a figure, right? But the choosing to get involved with effective altruism, with these like with like trying to engage with how can I do as much good as possible? How can I like not just do philosophy, but like apply those ethics? What was like what really moved you in those directions?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a big influence, like for a lot of people, was reading Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality, and just thinking, like, no, he's right. It really is important to save lives when we can. That seems like not something we should just ignore. And so, you know, I was thinking about that a lot in sort of early grad school. I know I was doing my PhD at Princeton, so Peter Singer was one of the professors there. So, you know, I was definitely thinking a lot about applied ethics and tying it in with the sort of consequentialist ethics that I was, you know, doing for my dissertation, more theoretically focused. And then I guess the main precipitating event for me in terms of then getting more engaged on the applied side of things was particularly when Nick Beckstead, who was in the same year of grad school at me, but at Rutgers, just sort of down the road a bit, he sort of reached out to me. We knew each other from taking some classes together. He told me about how they were starting up a Giving What We Can branch at Rutgers as the first US branch of Giving What We Can. This was back in like 2010, I think, maybe. And so I was like, wondering if you want to get involved. It seems like given your interest, the kind of thing you might be interested in. And I think just having that sort of personal sort of outreach just sort of clicked for me. I was like, yeah, I guess he's right. I should be more involved with this. So I ended up sort of working with a few other people to set up a Princeton branch of Giving What We Can back then.
Nice.
And so that was my sort of getting involved with the more applied side. And then I guess over the past couple of years, I've been getting sort of more involved in terms of my sort of blogging and just sort of internet presence, and thinking about applied issues, effective altruism, in addition to just my sort of usual blogging on utilitarianism and ethics in a theoretical way. I mean, one of the things that I guess has gotten me maybe a bit more involved here has been when Will McCaskill sort of asked me to sort of take over as lead editor for utilitarianism.net, the sort of open access website, explaining utilitarianism with a focus on its practical implications and sort of tie-ins with effective altruism and trying to actually do good in the world. And so that was a sort of a role in a project that got me very much more involved in public presentations of sort of ethics and its connections to applied ethics. That then is sort of tied in with my blogging as I sort of transitioned from my old philosophy blog to a new Substack, which has, I think, been quite useful just for getting a broader public audience. And a lot of that has been quite focused on applied ethics as well as the theoretical stuff that I sort of do in my research. So I guess that mix of factors, I guess, is maybe the best answer I can give.
That makes sense. It's something that's interesting. You brought up Peter Singer's partially an introduction, but in a lot of ways just a rehashing of a very old idea. It's like the drowning child, and do you have an obligation to save the drowning child? Interestingly, that specific hypothetical, that specific hypothetical apparently runs back really, really far. And Singer's contribution is mostly just like the how it was used. But beyond that, have you? I did want to bring up really quickly. Have you heard Bernie Sanders using the argument in favor of sharing the vaccine patents with other countries?
No, I don't think I'd heard this.
So I think it adds to
Sounds
what we're
good.
talking about. Yeah, exactly. That we're already having this permeation effect, that this like relatively young movement is able to have like an effect on some of the top progressive figures to be thinking like, how do we sell this? And the classic effective altruist argument of like, are you obligated to save this drowning child? Are you also obligated to save those dying from COVID-19 in other countries if you have the capacity to do so? So I thought that was really good, and also just like plays into the broad idea of like, this is how these movements are starting to come out and alive. The other question I wanted to ask though
That's
is
very cool.
yeah. The other question I wanted to ask was that's how you got involved with the movement. You said that it was like just personal outreach, basically, right? Personal outreach and reading, which I think is fairly standard for a lot of the. I hope you don't take this as offensive, but the nerdier types that kind of started the effective altruist movement.
Sure.
I say it with love as a compliment. But I guess the question would become just as a final closing, how do we convince people to do as much good as they can, to participate in these movements, and to at least just like take a step back and think like, could I be doing a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew. I mean, I guess as a philosopher, the means that appeals to me is to try to get the ideas out there and invite people to sort of reflect on their values and be like, don't you agree that like by your own lights, you would like to be able to be a positive influence in the world and make things better? Doesn't that appeal? Whether that's actually the most effective way, I mean, probably not. Philosophical arguments aren't like known for being like the most compelling things in the world to people compared to things like rhetoric and social influence of all different kinds. So, maybe the thing to do is really to like hire some marketers and get them to come up with a like really gripping film or novel or something that will like speak to people's emotions more. And maybe that would end up actually being more effective, but it's not the sort of thing I know how to do. So I guess I stick to the ideas.
That makes sense. Interestingly, as far as like when we talk about with the rhetoric, I think what turns people off from a lot of the philosophical arguments is that they can be hard to understand, and that they can be that they can feel like very abstract and moved away from life. But I think that when there's a philosophical argument like the drowning child. And you can argue that this appeals to emotions more than it does to logic or ration, I should say, reason. Um, but these arguments that are more like core about like not necessarily moving people on like the meta ethics or like phenomenal conservatism about ethics or whatever, but just like trusting that people kind of have intuitions about like they already kind of have intuitions about like there are general rules about morality. I should be consistent in how I apply my morality. And that if you can present me like a really clear situation where that rule doesn't make sense, that's something that we can move with. I think even a lot of these like philosophical arguments, especially like the thought experiment ones, the ones that are based around like getting people's intuitions to slightly shift over to do the sort of forcing people into the reflective equilibrium process. I think that can have a lot of good. And the empirics that we do have show that we don't have very many empirics, but what we have on rhetoric, the little bit of research we have on rhetoric, especially on those with particularly silly ideas like flat Earth or like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, we find that of all of the different rhetorical methods we have data on, the ability to guide someone through a logical process is the most effective. Not far behind is ridicule.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Not far behind is ridicule, which is less encouraging.
Yeah.
But and well
yeah, that's
below
what I
that,
would have expected. I would have guessed mockery to be like the way to go, probably. But
well below that, like about half as effective as either of those is empathy. But logic or like logical reasoning is slightly before ridicule.
Interesting. That's great.
So yeah, I think that gives a little bit of hope too.
And I think especially when you do have, as you mentioned, the sort of emotional hook of a thought experiment, and then you're building up a logical argument from that logical hook, that's sort of from the emotional hook, then through sort of logical consistency, pushing people along from there. That seems like a promising way to go, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think that we have too much time to get into it, but I do think that there are very interesting evolutionary psychology arguments about how humans are meant to think, how it's not supposed to be like individuals are not meant to be very rational at all. They're meant to come to the table with their large set of biases. And the thing that the human brain is really, really good at is having us having like a dialectic, right? Having one person be able to come to the table with their biases, another person be able to come to the table with their biases, and having those people hash it out with each other. And I think that gives a lot of hope that to the extent that we do have democracy, that can maybe help push towards the ethical systems and the ideas that we think are the most rational. Anyway, if you have anything else to say, go ahead. Otherwise, thank you for coming on.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much for the discussion. It's been fun.
It's been really, really interesting. I appreciate it. Once again, Richard Yetter Chappell is a philosopher who's done a ton of good work for effective altruism, for normative ethics in general. I think you could probably if there's anything specific that you want to shout out, or like any of your writings or anything, or you said that you work on certain effective altruist causes, so by all means.
Yeah, I mean, I encourage anyone interested in sort of learning more about my work. Well, most of all, encourage looking at utilitarianism.net just as a nice sort of overview of utilitarian ethics, arguments for it. We consider objections. I think it's a really cool resource that I'm very proud of contributing to. And for anyone interested in my own views more sort of personally, feel free to check out my Substack, rychappell.substack.com. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. It's been a good talk.